Yeah, we've literally built doomsday devices. The thing is, until we get to the point in terms of international relations, society, politics, everything, until we get to the point where we can start to down build and like really get away from that, threat that we built this entire world under the threat that we could erase it if something goes really wrong, or that we may erase it by mistake if something goes really, really wrong. We need to navigate that. We need to incur those costs with our eyes open.
Welcome back to War is Stupid, an anti-war podcast about war. My guest today is Andrew Facini, the communications director at the Council on Strategic Risks. If you're watching this, you could see it on the incredible fleece that he's wearing. And he's also a senior fellow at the Jan E. Nolan Center on Strategic Weapons. So he recently wrote a report called The Consequences of Tactical Nuclear Weapons Use that is available on the Council on Strategic Risks website. And now, full disclosure, I am incredibly intimidated to be talking about tactical nuclear weapons because I am bad at science. And I said a similar thing to Michael Greenberg, the founder of Climate Defiance, when we did an episode about ecocide. And he said that you don't have to be good at science to join the fight against climate change because the science has already been done. You just have to give a shit about wanting to stay alive on this planet. Is it fair to say that that is also true about the fight against nuclear weapons?
Yeah, trust me, I do not try to explain nuclear weapons, the ins and outs of all the policy, all of the details to everybody. It's too much. I can't ask anybody to say, hey, you know what you really need to also add to the long list of things you're carrying with you is a fear of nuclear war. However, if you do give a shit about the other risks that you care about, if you give a shit about the inequality stuff that kind of comes all the way down to, your home street, this does fit in there. And I do think that there's stuff we can talk about there that isn't just the straight up, eyes glazed, too big, not out of my hands thing, because that's where we can start making some progress.
So let's start at the very beginning. What are tactical nuclear weapons? What purpose do they ostensibly serve?
Right. So people know nuclear weapons. It's in the cultural zeitgeist. It's in everyone's heads, whether or not you grew up, in sort of a generation prior where you grew up with duck and cover and that kind of thing, or you're growing up now and you're seeing how the world is changing and reconfiguring pretty quickly. And, even in the last 10 years, there's been a real big spike of how much we're talking about this stuff and how much it's kind of coming back. Nuclear weapons are behind everything. They're kind of underpinning the security theory that we bring with us to all the states. And in the big picture, people know what that means. Usually it means, hey, we're going to turn the key one day and it's going to be the big, the red alert and the blasting alarms and everyone's going to just go up in smoke. The cities are going to explode. That's generally, what we brought with us from the Cold War, the theory that nuclear war, nuclear weapons means the big one. But for a big chunk of the Cold War, and now returning in a lot of people's logic, was the idea that maybe we can shrink these things down. Maybe we can have smaller nuclear weapons that are not really meant to be sent from country to country on a giant missile that goes towards a city, but instead goes towards the battlefield, right? If there's lots of tanks or troops in one spot, maybe we can use a small, tiny little guy to do something on the field and communicate that we're using nuclear weapons because we're really serious, but also we're not going to go fully to the mat. We're not going to knock out your cities. We're not going to go for your capital because there's got to be some way to get off of that ladder at some point, right? That's the theory. What folks need to know now is that theory, that logic, that was very much rooted in like the 1950s, where we were afraid of the Red Army rolling across Germany, and so what we need to do is have nuclear weapons on artillery shells and on short-range rockets and all sorts of crazy delivery ways, just to offset that conventional problem. That's coming back. And it's not necessarily from the same outgrowth. We're not worried about, the Russians rolling across into Europe, although that's a different discussion. We're worried that there's credibility gaps between, the things we can do with our military that we're pretty comfortable with after the war on terror, all the way up till that turning the keys, vaporize the cities moment. And it's found a fertile ground for this type of thinking when we're talking about future conflict with China, future conflict with Russia, future conflict with countries we don't know yet. That problem seems to have found a solution in let's build these things again. Let's start putting smaller nuclear weapons on different types of missiles, different types of delivery systems. Let's give them to the troops and put them out in the field so that, it's a little bit more frontline than it is big strategic smoky room, issue the order stuff. And it's coming back, and that's what worries me, and that's why we wrote this report at CSR. We wanted to take a look at, hey, well, okay, if we're going back to this, let's really get in that moment. Let's examine that day, the day where tactical nuclear weapons are used for the first time. It is officially now whatever conflict was boiling up is now a nuclear war, and we haven't yet taken out, New York and DC and Moscow or Beijing or whatever, but we are working on towards that, and it's unprecedented. That's what we wanted to get into is like, what is that day like? What actually are people worried about? How are we supposed to navigate that weird, cynical nuance where there can be some amount of escalation, there can be a little bit of nuclear weapons use, and yes, it's true that it wouldn't go straight to vaporizing each other's cities. But that's a level of war that's way different than what we've done, and that's a very scary moment that we have to navigate on the fly with everything that we brought with us. And so let's write a report about it. Let's start digging into it.
Thank you. And so you write in the report, can you walk us through the consequences of a nuclear blast? One thing that really resonated with me is how you write that there is physically on the planet no hospital system that has the capacity to absorb 10,000 severe injuries on the same day. So, like, as someone who everyone can understand the need of a doctor, the need to go to the hospital, the need to treat burns, what does a nuclear blast look like?
Yeah, and the short answer is that it's still terrifying at a smaller level. It's still more destruction than we are collectively or locally prepared to deal with on any level. And so there's a real reason that we should take nuclear weapons as a separate category, even if there's people trying to say if we dial it down to smaller versions of nuclear bombs, and even if we dial it down to like, oh, it's only military targets, that actually means something different qualitatively. So I mean, first of all, just a matter of scope too, and for people who are when we talk about nuclear war and we talk about like that big picture that we all carry with us in the culture, it is correct to think that like a bomb goes off and it's like, wow, the city is gone and it's as bad as it can get. That's mostly right when it comes to strategic nuclear weapons and sort of the big thing that can happen. But when we talk about dialing that down, we have to try to figure out exactly where in the scheme of things like a nuclear blast is in terms of power. And there's not a lot of things in between a regular military bomb that you would use in a regular sort of conflict, or even like a giant one, right? Like people remember maybe the Moab and that like really large bomb that they tried to deploy in Afghanistan. Uh, the military has done a lot of work to try to build the giant bombs or smaller ones that can penetrate. All that stuff is like way over here on the sort of log scale, the long tail of like bombs that can do stuff you can bring places. And then there's like this big gap, and then there's nuclear weapons even at the smallest level, right? In between, you can have some examples like the Beirut explosion people all remember from 2020. And I talk about this in the report. I talk about this a lot because it was a real clear example. There was a fire, so all these people were recording it, and it was shocking. This thing exploded, and it was, pretty powerful. You could see it devastated the port of Beirut, but it wasn't even quite at the scale yet of like a proper nuclear explosion. And so talking about tactical nuclear weapons, we're talking if you're getting into the deep parlance, I'm trying to avoid all of that stuff that I don't want people to even come away with this podcast and get stuck in their head with. But on the terms of like kilotons, it was how we measure how many tons of an explosion is. A strategic nuclear weapon might have 100 or 500 or even up to 1,000, which is a megaton. A tactical nuclear weapon might have 10 or 20. And that's not bringing it back down toward a regular conventional bomb. It's bringing it down towards what Hiroshima's bomb was, that first one that we studied in school, little boy, all those pictures of what happened in Hiroshima, that you think of it that way, and you think about how much in terms of ground radius was obliterated and how much was burned from the fire that it caused. That's what we're talking about when it comes to the argument to bring back smaller nuclear weapons. The ability to take that destruction and put it somewhere else, if it's at sea, if it's a naval battle, or if it's a ground battle and there's supposed to be troops somewhere, Or, even more cynically, what you talk about in the report, the logic is not really about burning ships or taking out troops. It's really about showing that you're willing to do this new level of escalation. And so you might actually see it targeted to airfields, which is kind of like the right size for about 20 kilotons, or command post or earthworks or something like that. And for us, you can walk through what happens when a bomb goes off, right? The blast is this giant force of light, first of all, that lights things on fire, burns people to a crisp, and then that heat differential causes this blast wave that you all might have seen in videos. It comes out from the center and it flattens buildings and it can take out windows at even miles away. And when you get down to the other scarier parts about this stuff, like there's a firestorm going because of this. The windows breaking means that far away, radioactive particles might get into all these houses, all that stuff. It's a mess, and it's a mess that no one's familiar with. And going into that day, like I said, the whole point was to put ourselves into the moment where a tactical nuclear weapon may have been used somewhere in conflict. It could be the U.S.-China problem that we always talk about. It could be Russia using it in Ukraine, which is what originally got us thinking about this. That scare in 2022, all of that stuff, it leads to a crisis that we've not seen before, right? The news cycle, we're all pretty familiar. Something shocking happens, breaking news alert. Depending on how bad it is, everyone's attention will be on it, leadership included. The focus for this type of national security problem is, it's ripe for everyone to just be dialed in. And that's the whole point, right? To do an escalation like this is really meant to get everyone's attention. And so when you get to that moment, you have to figure out how to communicate with people all of this scary stuff that just happened to somewhere, remote or somewhere more close to a settlement or even close to a city. All of the civilian damage that might happen, all of the casualties that might just be a part of the strike, which is maybe secondary or maybe even the whole point. All of that stuff needs to be communicated. The response from one state to the one that attacked it needs to be really well calibrated, because you can't just automatically assume escalation, because that's how you get to those big city burning missiles and all that stuff. And also you can't just have it be accepted. You can't say, okay, we're going to take it easy on this one because we really don't want to risk that escalation, because now you've just normalized the idea that tactical nuclear weapons can be used. And that's scary. That's a scarier world to deal with. Next conflict, any part of the world, any other country looking at this and watching carefully is going to take notes, and they're going to realize what we've said for a long time. Like, do these weapons give you, as a state, do they give you power? Does it make you strong to have nuclear weapons? Does it give you deterrence so that countries don't mess with you, so that you can do what you want? And we'll be testing all those theories on the fly. We'll be testing all those theories with the bench we have, I always say, like with the recent politics, right? Who's in the White House and what they were listening to on TV last night will matter a lot. Who won the most recent European Parliament, party swings, like that'll matter a lot. And that changes day to day, and it's not necessarily up to you to have this problem.
When we talk about the damage that can be done, where does the term tactical or strategic come from? Because they sound like euphemisms, like in a way to make it seem like in the same way that like a small drop of poison can still do a lot of harm. Like, it's still poison. Just because it's not the whole bottle doesn't mean it's any less lethal. Like, were these official Department of Defense, or I should say Department of War, sorry to dead name the Pentagon, are those, did the terms come from them?
Well, this is the best, actually, because coming into here and talking about this and trying to remember, I'm in my like lecturing shoes, and I'm talking too much about the ins and outs and the backs of this, and I'm not even remembering that to the public, to everybody that is kind of not involved in these conversations. This stuff doesn't make any sense. What is tactical and strategic? I mean, I'm so fluent in this that I don't even think, but in the terms we're talking about, tactical is something that's here on the battlefield. We're working on a problem, we're working on the enemy, the adversary, whatever situation it is, and that's short term. That's like you can affect U.S. Forces are taking on Russian forces, and like it's here, doing something here is tactical. And then there's another term called theater, which is like if it's battle and there's other battles, and the theater is Europe then, right? Like it's kind of things that affect that more terms of like where people can come from, where troops go, where the supplies are at. That can be a theater sort of weapon. And then strategic is the big one that always is kind of behind everything. It's the big board, it's Rand, it's the smoky room of saying, okay, well, at the bottom, at the end of the day, this all goes one way or the other. We can always decide to attack a country strategically, and that means taking out their economic centers, their industrial centers, their military headquarters, and all the places that they can get their troops marshaled from in long range attacks that are not really meant to solve that problem on the battlefield as much as it is meant to solve that country. And if that sounds kind of crazy, it's because, yeah, when we're talking about it's euphemistic all this way through, yes, we're going to target their economic centers of power and we're going to target their political centers of power. And I'm like, dog, you're just talking about cities. So
Yeah.
you're like what we're trying to say is like there is a line at some point that, goes between the tactical, which is like day to day stuff, and the strategic, which is, the big picture that hopefully working on the level of strategic means we're not actually going to do any of this stuff. But at some point, you do have to cross a line and say, oh, these things are to commit atrocities. And hopefully we don't have to, but that's the strategy. We have deterrence. This is the whole theory from going way back in the day that these weapons give you an ability to commit an atrocity on demand. And that should prevent the adversary that you're thinking about in this, and hopefully have communicated this all well too, from doing something that makes you want to use it. And if it works in both directions, vice versa, that's a mutual deterrence thing. You've heard of mutually assured destruction. Uh, Largely stable in the short term, largely stable on a year to year basis, but that requires a ton of maintenance, and that still involves a lot of risk. So yeah, totally, this is a euphemism. Totally, I'm just glazing over like, oh yeah, all these terms about, please, audience, don't let me go on about this. This is if it's crazy, call it out. We need to be able to talk about this stuff with the public. This should be more front of mind for voters. All this stuff that it's at odds with what I said before, is that this is so esoteric and crazy. I don't want anyone to have to go away with this on their mind as much as it's on mine. But I do want people to understand what it is we're doing and what all of this country is built on.
You mentioned the a scare in 2022 with Russia and Ukraine. I have yet to really dive into that conflict on this podcast. So do you mind telling us about it?
Yeah, so everyone remembers when in 2022 in February Russia invaded Ukraine, or full scale invaded Ukraine, because it was already messing around for many years. There was, in broad terms too, because there are many better Ukraine experts that can talk about this. But in broad terms, what happened was the very confident invasion was meant to take out Kyiv and the leadership and basically just win a war in like a week. And it didn't work. Got its defenses in order, and Russia didn't do a good job in its 5-day mission or whatever it was. And so the pushback was both surprising and alarming and kind of a scary moment for Russia. Reportedly, and this is all meant, based on sort of like a quip from Biden and some acknowledgments from people in the White House at the time, but it's not yet publicly fully known in the way that I would love to know. But reportedly, that by the end of that year, there were signals that Russian generals were communicating explicitly about, should we put our tactical nuclear weapons, ready to go in Ukraine, whether or not that meant to stop the bleeding of a counterattack or to press the advantage or other scenarios that we can come up with a billion. It scared the lights out of the West, and Biden administration did jump into action to communicate really explicitly to Russia, say, hey, please do not do this. We will not let that stand. Which is a rare moment of clarity in this war that has been basically for the last 3 years a battle between we must support Ukraine's defense, and we can't afford to go so big that we can't have Russia lose. Right? This constant tension between can either country lose? The answer is no. And so we ended up with this terrible, long dragged out war that is, benefiting pretty much nobody except cynically. That was where that came from. And in that moment, it got our wheels turning at CSR, and we were saying to ourselves, no one's really looked at what happened if this goes through. What happens if they, and in our imagination, they use a tactical nuclear weapon. So again, smaller but still a giant escalation to take out a Ukrainian air base or a rail yard or something like that. And we walked through all of the different sort of likely outcomes of what Russia would say to try to justify this, and what Ukraine would have to do to try to get as much support as it could in that moment. And then, from there, what does that mean if those things are competing in the first day for attention and for the narrative and all these things that are sort of squishier? They're not related to, the situation on the ground, also involve the situation on the ground. And that's what you said before, too. Like, one of the scarier things is to realize that even like a glancing blow to a city, which is like where most air bases are or rail yards or things that are important infrastructure, would result in five-figure, deaths and also, injuries, and most of those would be severe burns. And especially not in war-torn Ukraine, but even in this country, like we simply do not have the doctors, the medical beds, the expertise, the logistics to take care of that problem. And there are cases that we can study. There have been horrible fires, there's been explosions, there's been other things that show like the medical response is really hard. I mean, we have a hard time still in this country with all of the wealth and everything that we have to bring to bear, responding to like surprise floods, not even hurricanes, right? And no, that's horrible stuff, but that's lower stakes, it's local, and you would think that, okay, yeah, well, we could flow the resources of a nation towards something as scary as a tactical nuclear weapon explosion, but maybe not so. And we would be, I think we'd be shocked, horrified, and humbled to find out that there's no real amount of preparation that can get everybody ready to handle and process and recover from a nuclear weapon strike at any strength, in a way that is acceptable to most people. It's supposed to be an unacceptable level of damage. That's the whole plan. And yeah, thinking about Ukraine, that's still one of the places that I worry about. I also worry about South Asia a great deal. This this year's war in May was very bad, and we got to it. We got to closer to probably to the nuclear line for the both of those countries than has been since the 90s.
This is
And
Iran?
no, this is India, Pakistan, sorry.
No worries.
And yeah, and we moved on in like a week. Like it just
Yeah.
fell out of the news cycle. And this doesn't even mention North Korea, which is always antagonizing the problem with US and China, which is a collision course that everyone seems to acknowledge but doesn't really know what to do about. And, any number of other future problems that can be exacerbated by the US giving up its leadership around the world, or Russians, meddling in Africa, and, things that are kind of far from today's radar, but I worry about for tomorrow's radar.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive. Like when everything's an emergency, then you kind of like your nervous system just adapts and you're like able to tune out. So I I lose track of what the actual emergencies are like on the planet right now. Like I did mention Iran. So that was when yeah, the 12-day war, twice as long as the 6-day war, and that explicitly involved bombing nuclear facilities, or so they say. Like, so is the world a better place now?
We fixed it. It's done,
Yeah, we
right?
did it, Joe.
The problem of Iran has been a real great case study for all of these theories, because it's a classic security dilemma, right, in the region, and it's one that for years the US didn't want to, completely solve, right? Like, you don't necessarily want to go in and just do regime change all the time. Like, we lost our appetite for that gladly, but also like for the rough reasons that we did. And so,
An account of it not working or leading to worse things.
oh, boredom, let's go with,
Yeah.
right? Like, it's because like it doesn't work, but when has that stopped us? It's also it's a case too where the Iranians had figured out back in the back in the 90s, really, when they were starting to develop to like the modern version of this, but they don't really want to get a nuclear weapon, because if they do, Israel will for sure try to take it out, and probably the US will follow in earnest, and probably, Saudi would follow in earnest. Like, that's kind of like the line that everyone's pretty sure they can't cross. And so they got a lot out of, running up to the line, getting close to the line, and like dividing that space before you get to the line really narrowly, and working with the UN, kicking them out, working with the UN again, working with, the US and the Russians and the Europeans, and having the Obama run Iran deal really kind of was the most close thing we had to like a solution for all this, but it still didn't eliminate it, right? And there's a lot of reasons you can go into that, like why a country would want to bomb, right? So if the things we're talking about earlier, about like the ability to commit an atrocity, or the ability to threaten to commit an atrocity, to be able to like exert some deterrence and tell people, other states to back off and to leave us alone, you can see why that would be something that the Iranians would really want, given that they're kind of a pariah state that don't really have any allies. That can't happen if the first part is true, if they can't cross that line without really sparking the war. But they can't abandon it entirely because then what do they have? And the answer is probably nothing. And they definitely can't negotiate with the US over nothing. And so, did we solve it this year by bombing the facilities? Like I have we solved it any time there's been assassinations of scientists or blowing up of facilities or the Stuxnet type of interference with their program? Like no, this technology is old. This technology is quite understood. It's just a matter of time and logistics. And we're very lucky. I will say this is like a side note entirely, but at the Council on Strategic Risks, we also work on at the Nolan Center. We also work on biosecurity stuff, and I don't do that. I don't do that work really, but I have a lot of contact with the people who do. And hearing them talk about the risks we have of like any far-flung state, any non-governmental group or terrorist cell or whatever, or even just like a lone disaffected person, engineering like a bioweapon, like a super flu or something like that, is so high. It is scary how easy that stuff is comparatively because obviously we have a lot of bio labs, we have a lot of people working on this stuff, and the technology to actually go and do like gene editing is just like becoming so much more like low level, so easy to do, and so at hand, and the research is accessible and all that. Nuclear weapons, luckily, they have the ability to wipe out the world overnight, in a different type of sense. But it's literally physically, like scientifically, it's like alchemy. Like you just need to have this special rock, right? And you need to have enough of it, and you need to refine it in a very specific way, and then you need to arrange it in a very specific way. And the only way to do all of that really is to have like the resources of an entire state. And that's really fortunate because imagine if it was very easy. Imagine if it was as abundant as like iron, and we could just work with the fissile materials wherever, and you could be assembling little tiny like reactors in your backyard. Like that would be a bad world that we could not stop people from building bombs because it would just be around in the same way. So a
It's
quick shout out
nice. Yeah, it's nice to know things could always be worse. That this
it's
isn't the worst possible reality.
No, I mean, of course, states that we don't like and ourselves, we'll do all of those things, right? We'll have all of these programs in the Cold War, especially, but yeah, this stuff could always get scarier. There are things to count on. So with Iran, right? Like we set it back, but if the logic that we're bringing into this, again, to bring it back to like tactical nuclear weapons are coming back into vogue, if that holds and if it works out in any world future that those weapons are seen as acceptable, and even if they get used and then that use is sort of accepted, that to me is a giant signal for a country like Iran to be like, okay, well, that's what's on offer now, and if we don't have this, then we're going to be subject to this. And it's this like big prisoner's dilemma. Like, the world could be safer if we just chose again not to, to acknowledge the risks that we once did and back away from this, and to focus instead on like how do we make this as more secure peace as possible, knowing that that end of the chain, the city busting, day, that Armageddon moment is still there until we can figure out how to get out of that. I would rather have people not trying to reintegrate this logic down the chain. And there's a lot of ways that people can, hear me talk about this and they say, oh, well, it's not credible to just go from 0 to 100 on the day that, US is starting to fight with China over Taiwan. And I said, yeah, sure. But it's also like not credible to think that you can insert something on a chalkboard and say, well, here's the early stage escalation, the little bit of nuclear weapons we can use, the tiny little guys. They're different. It's qualitative, blah, blah, blah. To assume that that moment is controllable, that moment is kind of predictable in any way, is a giant risk. It's more risky than the uncredibility of going to strategic deterrence problems when we have a failure down the chain. That's just it's a logic thing that I am trying to, I wrote this like 70-page report trying to pull out this one piece of logic, which is that like, yeah, there's a lot of things you can do with these weapons, but like there's no world where you can use them that doesn't change the world overnight. And then that new world is so much harder to navigate than the one we have now. And even if we come at like a little bit of a disadvantage from not having or for foregoing this logic, that's part of the deal. That's what we have to deal with. We can solve those problems for sure. Come on.
Just how expensive are these weapons to build and maintain? Like, does the mere existence of these weapons and the government investment, how does that affect our day-to-day lives on the streets?
That's the best question that, and any anti-war podcast should be asking. It's great because I've gone this far and I haven't really even addressed this problem because why would I when, a lot of the proponents aren't doing it either, right? It's one of those cases where like we can certainly build double the arsenal we have now, right? Like there was a report from Heritage last year that just it's a bit of a wish list of like, well, we should have basically, hundreds more nuclear weapons ready to go at all times on different platforms we don't currently have. And if you get into the weeds of like military procurement and like industrial policy for the United States, we it's not a dig as much as it is just an observation to say like we can't build the boats we want to build. We can't have enough artillery or missiles or the other things that are like pretty standard fare for what should be a country preparing and expecting to maybe go to war in like a big way. And I say this because this is all like guns butter argument. Like obviously we should be doing more to take care of ourselves. As someone who recently had to, a run in with like a medical problem that cost me $500 just to be seen, like much less I haven't even gotten the bill yet. It's like that to me is and seeing the scene at the hospital recently, I was like, this is just this stuff is crazy. Like, what is it that we're doing? And so when we talk about nuclear weapons, and we talk about the modernization program that has been sort of like in the works and is largely due and probably needs to happen at some rate, we're talking about $1 trillion over the U.S. budget over the next like 9 years or whatever it was that, calculated at previously. And that was like the first estimate. Everything's gone over budget. It's going to be more than that. That doesn't include adding new like tactical nuclear weapon systems. Like if we're going to really develop new missiles to carry new and more warheads. Those things are very expensive. And we've built the national labs. And a lot of people don't really clock this either, but like the national labs, like, the Department of Energy runs the national labs in the United States. And the national labs are all more or less built towards building and maintaining nuclear weapons and doing research on nuclear weapons. They do other stuff too. And then they do a lot of really good other stuff. But, remember last year when there was this big news about the National Ignition Facility achieved laser-induced fusion. And it was a big deal because they're like, we got more energy out of it than we put into it. This is great. Everyone's like, oh, great. We're going to make a breakthrough on fusion energy finally. Like, geez. And, no, the real actual thing that we're doing is figuring out how they can do, laser-induced implosion of a target so that they can research how to do different types of nuclear warhead testing. Right? This stuff is all surprisingly built in, and it's a giant expense. It's a giant expense too for the country. We built it to be able to maintain the arsenal that we have now, the one that we largely brought in from the Cold War, and I've been kind of cool with since like New START was negotiated with Obama, and that's been a little over like 1,000 active warheads and the systems we have now. To expand that would put a big strain on both the labs and like the engineering needed to actually do this alchemy and do all this work to produce new or different warheads. But it would also strain the ability for our defense industrial base to build, the right amount of, for example, everyone's talking about the new submarine that we're building, the Columbia class. It's coming, but it's coming slower and more expensive. And to expand the number of missiles we want to be able to have at sea, we need to build more of those boats. And to build more of those boats, we need to start figuring out how we're going to actually do that, how we're going to pay for that, and we haven't. So there's a bit of non-credibility in all of this it's rough for me. And so when we talk about this, and again, prevent me please from rambling too far down the strategic.
No, this is excellent. Please. Yeah.
But when we get down to it, people are very keen to, and I say people that I usually argue with are very keen to have, they're trying to build an arsenal that is ready to face down like a superior numerically or even qualitatively Chinese like force at sea, in the air, with missiles, even in space. And we if you're doing the sort of tea leaf reading of like where that's going, we're not going to be able to outcompete China on this stuff. We're not going to be able to make more ships. We just simply are never going to be able to do that in this century. So my argument is like, I am understanding that they're trying to solve like a deterrence problem where like they're looking at what China might be able to do, and if we don't have an option to like escalate against China asymmetrically, we might just have to suffer this problem. I say to that, I say we need to double down on the deterrence focused activities we have, the strategic level, that top level of like, you cannot take away the strategic interests of the United States because we will have an answer for that. And the answer is horrible. That to me is where we've built our arsenal, and it can still work against China and Russia at the same time in the world that's shifting under our feet. That's where we should invest our time and money. And that, it's a commitment. It's going to require us to spend a lot of money. This modernization program, like I said, like $1 trillion through the next decade, doesn't account for tactical nuclear weapon expansion that's been called for. It doesn't account for, a giant shift over what types of platforms we need to build, or how many we need to build. That's just what we are locked into paying now with this, the stuff that we're trying to keep. To me, that, obviously that sucks. Like, I wish it didn't cost $1 trillion to continue having a mostly the same world. It's a rough thing we've given ourselves back in the day. But I don't want to make the mistake of giving tomorrow even more of a bill. And so as far as nuclear weapons go, and again, like, the big conception of like this stuff is like this, big sci-fi level, like, doomsday device stuff. Like, it's true. And I always look out the window when I talk about this stuff, because like I can see like part of the city skyline. Like, yeah, we want to keep cities and our lives and generally society intact, and we want to like figure out problems and go forward together. Broadly speaking, we shouldn't blow it up. That's kind of like the thing. Yeah, we literally built doomsday devices. The thing is, until we get to the point in terms of international relations, society, politics, everything, until we get to the point where we can start to down build and like really get away from that, threat that we built this entire world under, the threat that we could erase it if something goes really wrong, or that we may erase it by mistake if something goes really, really wrong. We need to navigate that. We need to incur those costs with our eyes open. We need to say, yeah, it's financially very expensive to do this stuff, so maybe we should do it smartly. And I thought we did. I thought transitioning the labs and everything to sort of be a maintenance organization of having the weapons we have now to like keep us going was probably a good call, especially back before, the sort of big shift in 2010s. But then it's also this other thing that we have to do that I always want to talk about in these stuff, is we have to hand off generationally the responsibility for these weapons. We have to teach, my generation is coming in as like kind of like the first active like analysts and policy people and government people after the active down building of the Cold War period, right? Like, a lot of our bosses and stuff were coming out of the Cold War with all of those lessons and all the treaties that we had to like earn by making lots of mistakes and almost blowing up the world to get. And over the last 30 years, we've slowly torn each of them up. We're probably on the last legs of any sort of arms control between the US and Russia soon. All of that stuff is getting thrown out the window, and we're trying to stand up a new generation of people who understand all that would happen historically and have anywhere near the amount of affinity to talk to the Russians, to talk to the Chinese, to talk to the Iranians, to talk to the Pakistanis. Like, all of this expertise needs to be maintained forever. It's a mandatory bill for humanity to say that we built this stuff, we built the doomsday machine. We can't just slack off. We can't just have it be like it falls apart because we ran out of money. We don't talk Russian anymore. Who cares? Whatever. Like, no, these things are going to exist, and if we get loose with them, if we either in terms of the rhetoric that we say about them, if for example we say we need to build smaller ones because we want to be able to use them more, or if we just simply get lazy with like the security and the prosperous sort of lab organization that we have, we run tremendous risks, and this stuff too is like, nuclear reactors are more this problem with nuclear waste, but like, a lot of this stuff lasts a really, really long time physically. You need to find a plan to deal with it over generations. Every 20 years, we got to hand it off, and hopefully we don't, fuck it up once, because once is enough with this stuff. And that's what always gets me back thinking, okay, let's get away from the chalkboard just a little bit. Let's connect it back to like humans and what are we good at? And it turns out not long-term planning.
Yeah, so these doomsday devices have existed for decades. What accounts for the fact that they haven't been used yet? Just mutually assured destruction?
Well, there's a combination of things. I love the, why haven't we done it yet? Because if you look backwards on all of the close calls we had, it is a real like, oh man, they should have done this. Like, we got real close. Everyone knows the Cuban Missile Crisis and what a actual, spark that was. We really, really came close. But if you look back on the other sort of list of mistakes, we call them broken arrows when like a nuclear weapon is accidentally dropped out of a plane on the US. Whoops. Like the ones that don't explode because they came like one safety away from doing it, or the mistakes that they make by, oops, we loaded a training tape into NORAD and it made everybody think we were under attack for 15 minutes before someone realized it was, oh, I left the tape in the cassette.
Oh
Uh,
my god, that
oh,
happened?
that happened. You can look
Oh,
these up.
that's like
These incidents are
sitcom shit.
no, because we literally, we watched the film War Games is like really basically what that was is, we're deluding ourselves into something that we might accidentally make world altering decisions based on. But you get those, and then you get the malfunctioning radar in the Soviet Union. In a lot of these cases, it comes down to like one dude who's on shift and has to make a call whether or not this is legit, whether or not this is something I should pass along. What should we go and should we turn the key? Should we push the button? Uh, and fortunately, the answer has been no. There's been no person who's done that yet. So far, the streak of our luck has been good, because it is luck in those cases. There is a lot to say about how, politically you get like you sort of like you can understand this kind of best through the eyes of like Reagan, right? Who came in as such a anti-Soviet, like pro-America war focused, kind of conservative, but then upon learning of all this stuff and upon watching a couple of choice movies, like, lost his nerve about this stuff. And when he got the chance to talk to Gorbachev, they were both like, yeah, this sucks. We should get rid of this as soon as possible because we're not going to, this isn't going to last. Like nobody actually wants to do it. And so this is the tension that's in this field. It's always between, you have to be super duper serious. You have to understand the technical stuff very well. You have to be fluent in military speak, and you have to be fluent in DC policy speak. And you have to have like a little bit of that, like, I don't know. I don't want to call it a mental illness, but you have to be a little bit focused in a way that I am, and a lot of people I know are. They're just like, I understand these risks. I'm going to talk about them all day, and I'm somehow not going to have like a breakdown at the end of every day because we're talking about this stuff that is absolutely at hand and absolutely, a pretty, compared to the actual what might happen, a pretty high risk. And so there is a desire not to do it also. But that doesn't work with the chalkboard. That doesn't work with the big tomes that were written in the 60s. That doesn't work with the strategies we put forward today that include like tactical nuclear weapons and all this stuff. Because those require like steely-eyed missile men who don't change their minds, who don't give in to the fear. They just have to execute. Because if you have doubt about whether or not it works, then it doesn't work. And you might actually, like, right, that's deterrence. Like if we're holding each other at gunpoint, but like, you're like staring at me and you're like, don't move, and I'm like giggling, like, you're not going to take my threat serious. Like that whole thing is like, you know what I mean? So you have to be very, very dialed in. You have to be, ultimate, generational long lock-in for a country. But you also have to have these people who understand that if something ever goes really wrong, like in the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the order came to, use, or when what was the story? The story was that the Soviet submarine heading towards the blockade was being attacked from above, and what the U.S. destroyer was doing was like trying to make it come to the surface by dropping some depth charges. They thought they were under attack, and so two of the officers in charge thought that they should launch a nuclear-armed torpedo, and the third one, who had to also give, he said no. Right? You have to have that one guy in there also to break that logic, to break that steely-eyed moment of like, we got this, we know what we're doing. You have to find a way to have a human in the loop of the logic. And it's funny. I don't even mean to say that with regards to like AI today, but that's super real today as we talk about more and more. People are trying to build strategic uses for AI and like how do we complement the Pentagon and how do we complement politics, and taking human ability to feel and think out of this moment that is probably the biggest moment that could ever be for humanity can't really be very good, right? Like that can only result in, again, a chalkboard should not define how
Yeah.
humans go into the 2100s.
Yeah, Siri doesn't have skin that'll get burns. Like Siri won't suffer the consequences. So
I mean,
does
what's the first thing that happens in, Terminator? Or I guess you see it more in Terminator 2, right? But like the first thing Skynet does when it achieves sentience is to get nuclear weapons launched on Russia so that the US and the Russians have a huge war because they don't care.
Yeah.
Because that's, and that take us all out. Like why deal with these crazy, humans?
Man, so it, yeah, and it AI just, it sounds like it's enhancing the likelihood tenfold.
Sometimes, yes. And we deal with this in the report a little bit when we focus on the tactical nuclear weapon program, because, when you talk about tactical nuclear weapons, it lets you focus in on the day of. And, my co-author Lily, who really does a great job with these like forecasting model stuff, and also is really keyed into like what the actual applications of AI have been. She wrote this really wonderful part about how if you look at the behavior of an AI system that's like meant to be, informing the military, informing like a strategy, or informing like a commander in a tactical situation, not to mix up all of the language at once. But a lot of these AI programs that are meant to analyze data and provide like a solution are risk taking. Like they have this like emergent ability to just go and say like we're gonna raise the stakes. It's like the story about how shoot, I forget where it came from. I would really love to cite who was telling the story, but there was like an algorithm writing um competition for like computer science students, and the goal was to write a program that could play poker and win the most, right? Like if thens and whatever. And one person wrote like a 10 kilobyte program that was just basically like go all in. And that was the only move. Just always escalate, always go all in, and it never lost because everyone else was like, I'm going to build risk aversion into my thing. I'm going to build it. And they just like, it turns out that if you build your algorithm a certain way, you build these AI a certain way, it might take on these really inhuman and very inhumane sort of approaches that I wouldn't want the stakes to be, nuclear war. I don't want the stakes to be anyone in particular's life. I don't want the stakes to be a budget problem for my hometown. Like this is stuff that humans got to figure out. If we get it wrong, at least we can get it wrong for human sake, but we shouldn't get it wrong on the nuclear weapon side anyway. But this whole thing is technical, like, oh wow, AI's got a lot of problems to solve. And I was shocked to find out how much that's true, how much the emerging AI stuff is something we need to work on and we need to get funded to work on and we need to keep figuring out what it means. But for me, I'm reading all this and I'm saying, wow, that's great. But like the poker example, if you wrote that thing to say always go all in forever, and I'm across the table and I'm like trying to come up with my plans, and you go all in right away and you like escalate, right? And I'm just like, I have to not only consider, do you actually believe you want to go all in? Or do you have a program telling you that that's what you should do? Or did someone mess up your program and now you're just listening to them? And so am I even talking to you in terms of like, are we going to escalate this thing? How am I going to do it? Imagine that happening in war. Imagine that happening where something horrible like a tactical nuclear weapon gets used and, people are dying and it's this horrible program. And yet you can't be 100% sure why it happened. Even if it's like 10% doubt, that to me is completely different problem than I'm staring straight at the Russian, commander, or I'm staring straight at the leadership in Beijing and trying to figure out like, okay, how are we going to fix this problem? How are we going to navigate this crisis? If I'm thinking that they're involving computers, that changes my thinking a lot too. And what is that going to, like, where's the trust that you need to navigate this program? Like there's a lot that gets built into that moment that, I think it freaks me out. I think it rightly freaks me out because uh, not only have we not done it before, but we've never done it before. We have a lot of examples in the Cold War of how to like navigate a crisis and how to hopefully get out, by the skin of our teeth kind of thing. But a lot of things we're doing today are new, and they're doing it at a time where the geopolitical problem is like very much shifting under our feet and the technological problems are really cooking everyone's brains. And we're going into it again. If it happens tomorrow, it happens tomorrow. We have to deal with it with the powers we have now, with the capabilities we've built, with the ideas we have in our heads, with short form video, probably in present ranks of like most people in like the White House and in the Kremlin. Like it just isn't, it's not a great place to be.
And there are financial incentives, like in addition to obviously the military industrial complex benefiting financially from manufacturing these weapons. I just saw that Kalshi and Polymarket have now teamed up with CNN, and there was this report on 404 News about how someone manipulated a map to show Russia further into Ukraine in order to increase their Kalshi payout. Like, what the hell is happening?
Yeah, guys, and we have examples of leaders, and not just to pick on Trump or anything, but we have examples of many leaders being duped by, the current media environment. Because like it's hard to tell what's real anymore, and that's by design. I mean, look, I could go on. I think that CNN partnership is going to be tragic. I think there's going to be a horrible sort of outcome to all of this. I think gambling on this stuff is just toxic, obviously. But like, when it comes down to who the incentives are, like, wait, are you implying that people are willing to bet on horrible things and you get away with the consequences? Because I don't like that. Like it's
Yeah,
They're
at least in sports, there's some plausible deniability. But
then the sports are like, what happens if the game doesn't go right and you
yeah.
lose some money? Like, okay, you lost the game. I do not want to start messing around with this. It's a weird billion-dollar industry that's showing up in places that should be completely devoid of that kind of influence, and there we go. But like, even on a bigger picture, not even picking on like betting culture in particular, but like the okay, so you've heard of Golden Dome, right? Like the missile defense shield that Trump is trying to build. Yeah, also very expensive, also likely into the trillions to try to even attempt it. Um, we have a piece coming out about like why that's strategically messy. Because like if we were holding each other at gunpoint, right, and I had like a ballistic shield in front of me, like you'd be freaked out because like what would stop me and all that, it would be a problem, and you would find a new way to get around it. But anyway, um, the thing that always gets me about missile defense, especially, but this is true in nuclear weapons in general, is that people trying to sell you a big solution. And I say sell, it's cynical, but like truly, they're trying to sell some solution for which, if it fails and there's a nuclear war, there will be no means to hold them accountable. If you're buying Golden Dome to $1 trillion and all this money is going to all these different contractors and space launch people and missile developers and all that stuff, and everyone's making out well, cool. There's no reason to really think that if they're going to care if it works.
Yeah. They
Like
already
that's
got their
cynical, right?
bag.
But they got the bag. In fact, it may be even expedient for them to make sure it doesn't work, right? Like it doesn't, because like if it works just a little bit, like there might be a country left to like prosecute everybody. So it's one of those weird things that like this is. I don't want to flirt with conspiracy theories. I don't want to say anything something like that. But like I always tell people, you have to be very wary of folks who are trying to get something accomplished and have a really big stake in doing it, that at the end of the day cannot be held accountable if it fails. This is sort of true of like putting AI in charge. Like you can't hold AI accountable if they make a bad decision. But for stuff that's like kind of like premised industries that deal with the end of the world, industries would deal with, we're trying to prevent war, trying to prevent something terrible from wiping everything away. There's a giant issue with outsourcing to private interests that we've never really gotten ahead of. We never really solved. I mean, this is how the defense industry works in America. This is how all the industrial, sort of interactions work. They're all private industry. They all have other things to do as well. But when you're trying to do one big giant, like we're going to solve this thing, it freaks me out a little bit because it's not something that can be solved with the technology or capability. In fact, it can like we're going to put in this piece. It very probably can only be exacerbated by new technologies and new abilities and new defenses, at least in the short term. From there, uh, it's on people. It's on us to talk to people in Russia, in Russia and China and all the other countries, and try to figure out, okay, how do we get through the next 20 years together? How do we coexist? How do we prevent, really bad behaviors as best we can? And how do we enforce some of the norms we care about? But beyond that, it's not about, I'm going to, like, I'm not going to say, screw you. I'm going to be in a perfect little bubble and you're never going to be able to touch me, because that doesn't work. And it's not sustainable on a bunch of levels, but it's about syncing up the desire to not end the world, which you would think would be a very good argument for a lot of people. You think that'd be very popular, but there's always good careers to be made by being a hawk. There's always good careers to be made by going for short-term capability. No one's ever lost a job by saying we need more options, and that's a rough kind of imbalance in this field.
So what can we do? Is there any legislation or any lawmakers or activists that like you think have a plan and are worth supporting?
I guess it's been very rough, and the sort of like I said, the problem at the top of the show, I said I don't really want anyone to have to carry with them the things I know about and work on every day, because that's crazy. You got enough going on, you can worry about the climate problem or something. Like I'll worry about this stuff, but at the end of the day, it does need to be put into like a public policy effort. And for the United States, right, like for what this country can do, I think the best thing it can do is get some engines turning within the government to rebuild both like the professional government jobs of like the State Department, Department of Energy, all that stuff that is built toward like reaching out to other countries. Whether or not it's just understanding and we're building a real expertise, we're making more Mandarin speakers, and we're going to try to do our best to like sync up and actually create a culture of, cooperation with these countries. That's the first thing. And then to have it also be like this field that I work in is probably somewhere between 500 and like 1,000 jobs total, right? Like the expertise is not very wide. This includes people who come and go from the government, but not necessarily all the government jobs. We need someone to come in and fund this work. We need to have a generation of like American expertise bit supported. And it's been rough because, well, it's been rough for all NGOs. It's not just this field. So, you know, we look at this and we say, well, how can we keep those lessons alive? How can we better position the United States to accept the lessons of the Cold War, pass it off to the current generation, and then for all of us to have like good, stable jobs that work towards this issue and try to find new things, and then position us to be in a good, stable position to do that for the next generation. Like this needs to be this. It's mandatory. It's it's the vegetables. You have to eat the vegetables. Like it's not going anywhere, and it's important to do. It doesn't cost that much to do this work. Now, there are other things you can say, like, okay, well, if we're going to spend trillions of dollars, like, okay, yeah, we probably should be modernizing the strategic deterrent. We probably should make sure that that lasts as long as I'm talking about with the handing it off of generations. But that needs to be towards a clear-minded goal. It can't just be pursuing capability. It can't just be pursuing dominance. I mean, you see that all across American strategy now is like this escalation dominance, American energy dominance, and financial dominance. Like all this stuff it's very toxic. But it does not lead to flexible, adaptable, and like long-term goals. It leads to short-term pillaging, which is what we're seeing. I think that that's the biggest like anti-war thing we can do is shift everything that the country does, like all of the big motions of the military and the State Department, all these things, more toward cooperation, if not international, big lib, everything's cool, hunky dory, internet. If it's not that, it can still be how does an American, diplomacy look with regards to China exerting itself more and more, or with regards to Russia falling on its face economically, or with regards to, Iran doing what it's going to do next after these strikes. Like all these things need to be actually taken with a longer term view than we usually get to have. That's a function of politics and all these things that we may never overcome completely, but I think we can do a lot of work there. And I don't think this is partisan. I don't think this is one of those things that comes in and says like, oh, he's just he's a lefty, he wants to, put daisies in all of the gun barrels. Like, no, no, no. Maybe we could do some of that. Maybe we can actually smartly do that. But there's a way to actually build a world where we can be better positioned to solve all the other problems that are going to come, because they're going to come. Like we're dealing with climate change every single day now. Whether or not you want to acknowledge it, it's still a risk that needs to be worked on, and it's still an impact. We're dealing with cultural fall apart. We're dealing with the government kind of hollowing out of a lot of the resources that small towns depend on. Like all these things are really much more present for people, and I don't want to do all of that navigating, and I don't want to have to try to figure out. There's two ways to look at this. I don't want to do A. I don't want to look at it that way and then have to do it while we're also worried about like fighting a nuclear war.
Yeah.
Because like this Gulf is a hollow country. That country needs help, and that country is not going to get it by starting or being on the recipient end of nuclear weapons. Like it doesn't work. And then B is like the inversion of that, where it's like I don't want to be like taking from the former to do the latter. And I don't actually want to take from the latter and do the former either. I want eventually we need to be building down this like giant expenditure of nuclear weapons, but like we had to do it smartly. In the meantime, like we can't just go insular and, try to do the whole America first thing where we just, the good version maybe, where we actually invest instead of pillage the country. We invest in our education and stuff. We can't do all of that in a world where, everything is going to be sort of held hostage by bad behaviors that we, again, enabled up to this point. And so there needs to be like this middle ground. And it's weird to advocate on this. It doesn't feel like, it doesn't feel very aligned to where I usually am politically. But I think that this is just such a specifically hard problem to solve. And historically, it's been one that only, a very few people, almost all men, have been able to have anything to say about it, right? Like that's just by design. That's our failures as a culture that have built, how nuclear weapons policy has been formed. But we need to open that up too, and we need to figure out better solutions, because we're definitely not doing ones that are on the table now. We definitely not seeing ones that are going to come. But that's the future for me. I think that is hope. It builds into the other things we care about. It builds into like approach that way on this big high over there issue that is like, who wants to talk about it? The same approaches that work for that also work when you're trying to sell people on how we can, rebuild a better city and keep things more affordable. It works for when you want to run for like a state level position and you say, hey, we're going to try to position this country to be more efficient in these ways, and we're going to take care of people this way. It's like the rebalancing of that stuff. It's just so tacky and all these little things, but it really plays to a big picture that like you can turn this boat. It's going to take a little while, and it's going to be hard to do, and it's going to cost a lot of money, but we can do it.
So it's not as cut and dry as yeah, the maintaining nuclear weapons is at the expense of communities when there are jobs to be had, and it's part, and it could help build the community.
Maybe, and in some cases too, there's some people, shout out my friend Matt at the Federation of American Scientists did all this work to talk about like those ICBM communities, the ones that are dependent on those missiles being in the Dakotas, for example. Like there are local cases like that, but what I'm even talking about too is like reorienting our approach to like enforcement of laws and stuff.
Ooh.
Like we
Oh
were
yeah,
okay,
that's a
so
novel idea. I remember.
yeah, it's one of those cases where international affairs, right, existing in a world where the rules of the road are only defined by agreements between countries slash enforcement between countries, and it's always been this chaotic place. It's just how it is. Um, we were looking at in 2020, we were looking at the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima, right? We were looking at how to really talk about the issue this many years later. There are still survivors, there's still impacts from the bomb, but how do you actually connect it today? And the answer then was to look at what everyone was talking about, the national conversation on local policing. Because when we build a strategy that involves nuclear weapons, when we build a strategy that involves tactical nuclear weapons, right, to like slide it in on the scale somewhere lower, all of this has been, and it's only increased since then, premised on punishment. It's premised on, if bad thing, then we bad thing, right? It's a kind of, it follows its own violent logic. And that was, to me, the most salient sort of observation is that if you care about the communities that are hurt by oppressive policing, or if you care about the communities that are hurt by extractive, industries and things that, cost the town its livelihood, it's the same logic that gets you to think about, we're not going to work with adversaries, we're going to threaten adversaries. We're not going to fix dynamics in the world that are causing harms and causing, violence in places. We're just going to show up and have the biggest stick. And that's all connected, right? That's all a theory of security that needs to be kind of put forward in the big picture and the small picture at the same time. And that's why I get really punchy about when people try to talk about, well, the credibility of a top level deterrence thing versus like, what if we made the nuclear weapons small again and put them on different things? Like that's a chalkboard argument. Chalkboard argument doesn't have theory of security in it. It has the theory of the chalkboard. It has the theory of what the problem is you're trying to solve. And I do give credit to like where this logic flows, because it does flow and you have to work with it. But when you're trying to solve it generationally and you're trying to solve it with a mind toward what that day looks like after a bomb goes off, it all looks a lot more like we need to come up with an approach to other humans. We need to like find a way to live on the same planet. And if your answer is consistently and only, like carceral, if your answer is consistently and only dictatorial and authoritarian abroad, and your answer is lawlessness, then that's going to all be in the same stack of decisions. And so I think that you have to be really careful when you talk about like nuclear weapons and optionality and things people do.
And just to bring things into the zeitgeist, and it's end of the year, best of 2025 pop culture going into award season. Nuclear weapons are in the zeitgeist again. So what is your expert opinion on the movie A House of Dynamite?
Yeah, House of Dynamite. It's so funny. I watched that movie by myself, and I watched it with my partner, and I watched it I think a third time with some other people. Every single time I left there being like, wow, it was so nice of Catherine Bigelow to make a movie just for me.
Yeah.
Like the questions that lay people have about this are credit to the movie. They're the questions you should be asking. Like, is this real? Can this actually happen? Do we have this ability? Do we have that thing? Why would it be this way? That's all stuff that I'm glad people are asking. Again, like I don't want people to have to carry this and have more anxiety in their day, but I do think that that is the right, like, shout out the movie for asking those questions or making people think about it. The scenario that it portrayed in the film, and spoilers, I'm sorry if you haven't seen it, maybe pause and whatever, we can talk about, I'll just holding music for a second while you go watch it.
No.
But the scenario is both one that can sort of maybe be plausibly happen, like it maybe it shows that there is like a singular missile coming at Chicago, at like the heartland, and we never find out who it's from, because there's maybe cyber reason. There's just doubt. There's
Yeah,
general doubt
that's
about
the
why.
scariest part. Like, is it possible to launch missiles from an incognito window?
Maybe, you
Wow.
know, the United States has very, very good sensing and the ability to like track, submarines and other things that are supposed to be incognito. Uh, but are they perfect? No. And can they be messed with? Maybe. So this is why I sort of buy the premise of like, wow, we could be really put into position, because the problem was we don't know what to do. Our defenses didn't work, as they likely wouldn't work in the real world scenario. And so we're just stuck with a missile with, presumably, again, they never even say, but presumably a nuclear weapon is heading to Chicago. Like we don't know. And so the thing that breaks down this whole like very scary telling of this tale is when they really start doing the classic, the stratcom commander puts on a cowboy hat and like, yeah, we're gonna go, like
Yeah.
that whole approach just is not how it works. And there's no world in which the national security conference that is happening would be clamoring for the president to make a decision about nuclear weapons use before that one singular one lands and before they can identify where it came from or what happened. There's no world where they would be pushing for it under that. That's all movie. That's all movie making to let you get to the end of it where they have to make this like really pressure decision and then leave you with the thoughts. Which, like, big cheers, that's classic movie stuff. That's classic, sci-fi, big question. I don't know how to answer this because I'm not going to give you the answer. And that's classic like thriller movie making. And I liked it, but most people don't like it. Most people are like, that's bullshit. I want to know what happens. And I'm like, yeah, me too. That's kind of the point.
Yeah, what's interesting is that they keep it a secret from the people of Chicago, that they don't even try to evacuate or tell people to hunker down. That's kind of like a fatalist, like, yeah, once our systems fail, the when Dylan Baker, instead of telling his daughter, jumps off the roof of the Pentagon.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's that to me, that human stuff of like overwhelming dread, depression, and anxiety that like peaks at that moment is where it's at. That's what it's like. There's examples that we can all look back on, and there's a lot of recounts of like 9/11 where the rumors just went wild because nobody really knew what was going on, even in the government with like all the intelligence and all the connections that they could give. There was nothing impeding the like communications with the president other than the fact that the president was like moving around, right? Like things like that are real, and things that show up in a moment of like, well, what do you do? And not having an answer. That stuff I do want people to engage with a bit, because we like to think that society and the world and the things that we do day to day is all very built in. It's all very strong structure and infrastructure, and it just isn't, right? Like, we're all humans doing stuff. We agree to certain, structures of things because it works and because it has worked and because I don't want to be bothered, and I'm walking here, right? Like, it's
Yeah.
fine. But when things hit the fan, like, it's a terrible feeling to not have an answer. It's a terrible feeling to not be in a place where you can like go and fix stuff. And the truth of the matter is, if we detect an ICBM coming in the sort of trajectory they talked about, like, yeah, you have 25, 30 minutes. If you've detected it like right off the bat and you can do everything you can, and say it takes 5-10 minutes to like identify and figure out what it is, you have 15 minutes. Are you going to tell Chicago to, get out in 15 minutes? That's not going to work. There's a whole story, and I was very interested in this for a long time, about how in the 50s there was this big push for like, it's American and it's patriotic to be like civil defense minded, dig your shelter in your backyard and have your basement have a bunch of crackers and water and crap and blah blah blah. And that all evaporated in the 60s. Like, by the end of the 60s, it was just like, that doesn't happen anymore. Like, the Cuban Missile Crisis was like the last hurrah of like people were thinking about this, because it just doesn't matter when you're talking about giant nuclear weapons. Doesn't work. And also, if it was US Soviet sort of big war, like, even surviving it doesn't work. Like, you're going to be starving or irradiated and it's going to be terrible. And then the other thing is that like the timing is just, it changed. We live in a world where 15-20 minutes is, so scarce, but you're not going to evacuate New York or Chicago or Miami or DC. Like, it just isn't going to happen. And so there's no real use in preparing, which is like kind of a shitty way to end it. But like, yeah, what are you going to do? The only winning move is not to play, right? Like, as war games would tell us. And so that's where we get the sort of like unsatisfying answer in A House of Dynamite, where they're just kind of like, well, we just have to like stare at the screen and watch something hit Chicago and see what happens. Like, that's crazy. But that's kind of where we're at. That's one of the things. And that's like been true for long enough that most people should this should not be too big of a shock, but apparently we do need to remind a lot of the, people in policy and leadership class to like this is the world we built. This is the technology that we have. The planet is not that big that you can't sneak a missile over, in 45 minutes. Like it can be done. And that sucks.
So I guess the best we could do is again, I don't want to sound like I'm putting flowers in the rifle of the gun. Yeah, mutual cooperation.
Yeah.
We're on the
It-
same planet. It does not behoove you to blow it up.
Mutual cooperation does not mean surrender. It does not mean, flower power, bro. It does not mean like you have to love like the Chinese
Yeah.
in this war. Like you don't have to. In fact, cooperation with your adversary is extremely effective. We already understand mostly what the Japanese and the South Koreans want, what the Filipinos want. Like we'll work with the partners and the allies, and that's cooperation. We always think that's cooperation, and everything else got to be not cooperation. But like no, cooperating with China in a way that lets conflict be much less likely and, towards the problem of Taiwan or whatever, like that's the work that we should be doing. Even if you get just a little bit there, that's way more effective than like an additional reassurance to Tokyo, right? That's like we're talking about how to coexist for 2 decades. And beefing up defenses and reassuring partners is a good thing to do, and it's something we got to keep doing. But people have this aversion to talking to adversaries because like something about the adversary being bad will like rub off on you, or like it'll show that you're like soft or something. And that's cheap. That's like that's dumb masculinity showing up in politics, right? That's like, that's anathema to like Hegseth's whole lethality thing. When if the military would be stronger, more capable of fighting, more capable of deterring fighting by having more, translators and more exchanges with people in China, like we should be doing that all day. But
Yeah,
it's not the aesthetic.
right. That's so interesting. Yeah, there it's a vibes based policy, and this is the opposite of like flower power. But doesn't like global capitalism demand cooperation with China? Like, isn't a lot manufactured there? Like, isn't it just better for every major corporation not to want to be able to do business with China?
Yeah, and you may argue it's mandatory at this point.
Yeah.
I've seen a couple of reports, people trying to figure out what to do if China becomes aggressive about Taiwan, and like what are our levers to pull that stop short of nuclear war, right? Like a good goal. And a lot of them are like, oh, we got to pressure them economically, and I'm like, with what?
Yeah.
That's not a glib response, and I don't want to be like, to true economic experts. I don't want to just hand wave the problem, but like the solution is, well, we should probably be more aware and cognizant of the fact that like we're intertwined in a way that, it may not be ideal and it may not be something we want to aspire to, but the idea of cooperation has been built in for decades now. If we can do that and reduce exploitation and reduce, the harms that get caused environmentally and socially and all that crap, like that's probably worth doing, like before anything else. And so throwing things aside, I mean, this is, I think the biggest, if I could, kind of like land the plane on tactical nuclear weapons and like why we had a pod about this really niche issue, it's because the logic that empowers these, and again, like it's this like masculine sort of aesthetic of like we got to be tough and we got to have a hockey approach and we're gonna build more, we're gonna spend more money, all the things that go with that. It requires suspending sort of the rest of the conversation. It requires suspending the contexts that we all live in. And it's not necessarily been 100% good to have this globalized world of like mostly liberal values and like trade and stuff. But it's definitely something that you can't just forget exists. And, similarly, like if you're going to have a nuclear war, like you can't just look at the chalkboard and be like, that's where this goes. We're at this rung of the ladder of escalation, because that has tons of implications horizontally and not just necessarily vertically. And all those other ones have knock-on effects to the rest of the world. That's just how it is. And so people, listening to this podcast can be from anywhere in the world. It can be, I know you have millions of followers, so it's really important to get this right.
Thanks,
But it's
yeah.
one of those cases where,
Not yet.
it's just one of those cases though that we can talk to each other. We have more ability to talk to each other and understand each other and to try to do our best with each other. And we have to fight more those forces that want to remove context and distort the findings and use it for cynical means. And that shows up everywhere. That's the empowering sort of logic behind tactical nuclear weapons specifically. You could argue that's the empowering logic behind, strategic deterrence and all that stuff too, to some degree. But just, heads up, like watch this stuff, watch who's got the interests and what's being pushed. It isn't a game of sitting back and being like, again, like the contrarian sort of like online person of like, oh, this they just want to get the money out of this and whatever. Like, the sort of like I call this like the older cousin approach, where it's like you're not actually arguing for something better. You're just pointing out that things are cynical, and I'm like, yeah, man, you watched a lot of South Park, we get it. But it's more than that. It's like it is observing those trends. It's observing who's got what to stand, and then realizing that within there, if you do understand and you do believe that we all are just humans on this planet, well, then there's something to work with, and that's a head start. I always end up with like an optimism because like, yeah, when was the last time you met somebody in person and you were like, oh yeah, you are exactly a caricature of an evil person? Like, no, most of the time you're like, oh, I understand. Okay, let's what do we agree on? Let's talk from there. Like, let's get some food. Like that, that's human instinct. And I think we can always have that in the back pocket.
That's great. I think you did it. I think you successfully landed the plane. Thank you so much. Where can people find you or your work?
Yeah, please. You can find this report at the Council on Strategic Risks. You can just check out the Nolan Center, which is one of our constituent centers there, and find it there. You can find my work there, and I'm on Blue Sky if you want to see my really dumb takes on stuff. But that's about it. Be good to each other. That's my main thing. It's the holiday season, Orly. We have
Yes.
to we have to end up with some sort of jingle bell thing. I don't know.
Exactly. Yeah. And now you're prepared to take on your older cousin with actual policy pitches than just things suck.
And optimism. Bring it. You bring the connection, bring some light. If someone wants to fight you because the world is dark, like, yeah, it's true, but the world is not all dark and we can work with that.
Amen. Thank you for listening and or watching War is Stupid, an anti-war podcast about war. Please subscribe, rate and review, tell your dads. We'll see you next time.